So I think, to be honest, China has leapfrogged the West in industry after industry. Take turbines, take telecom switches, take everything except the very high end of semiconductors. If the US really wants to have an adversarial relationship with China, this has massive, massive implications for the US stock markets. You know, what's the value of Apple without China? What's the value of Tesla without China? What's the value of Walmart? What's the value of ExxonMobil that does a ton of business in China? You wait patiently till the Kuomintang comes back in power, then you open the checkbook, you do a lot of deals, and you tie up Taiwan economically with China. So if you're worried about Taiwan from that front, it's a wrong worry. If you go back to 2018, when the US punches China, China takes the punch. You go back to 2021, China punches China again takes the punch. But during this time, it's preparing. 2025, Trump comes back in and punches China again. And this time, China says, okay, you want to do this? Fine. Gloves off, let's go. Today, we have Russia, the biggest producer of cheapest commodities in the world. You have China, the biggest provider of capital goods, the biggest provider of capital now to other emerging markets because they have the cheapest cost of capital in the world, and the biggest producer of consumer goods. And then you have India, which is the biggest provider of cheap labor. And now those three leaders are saying, we're going to put these three things together, mix it in a pot, and see what comes out as a stew. Cheapest commodities, cheapest capital goods, cheapest cost of capital, cheapest consumer goods, cheapest cost of labor. It's going to be a boom of epic proportion.
大家好，今天要分享的是法国经济学家路易·加夫最近一段访谈的节选。路易·加夫是一位知名的法国学者、经济学家和金融分析师，同时也是一位在全球宏观经济和地缘政治领域具有影响力的评论员。加夫并非主流经济学界的象牙塔学者，他更侧重于将经济分析与实际投资策略相结合，因此他的观点在金融市场和商业决策层中拥有不少听众。他最引人注目的标签就是中国经济的长期看好者和西方对华误读的批判者。他经常在媒体上纠正西方对中国经济的偏见，并用详实的数据和逻辑来阐述他的观点。加夫是过去10多年里持续并坚定地预测中国将继续保持高速增长，并最终成为全球领先经济体的西方经济学家之一。当许多西方观察家在不断预言中国崩溃论时，他始终站在对立面，认为中国的增长模式有其内在逻辑和韧性。就像他在这段访谈中所谈到的，他认为2018年是中国政策向摆脱美国的依赖，全力打造自己的科技生态的关键转折点。7年后的今天，美国已经承受不起与中国对抗的代价了，包括中美贸易战、台湾问题、中印俄经济一体化以及中美人工智能竞赛等话题，路易·加夫都在这次访谈中做了精彩的评述。我们来看看他是怎么说的。
So a couple of years ago, well, actually this goes back to 2017, 2018, when the US administration limited the access that ZTE and Huawei had to US tech products. And without sort of those inputs into their own products, their businesses were essentially shut down. And that was a really important event because it woke up Xi Jinping to say, you know what, we cannot rely on the US as much as we used to. And we need to start a whole campaign here on developing our own technologies, our own competitiveness, and our ability to do things ourselves rather than relying on them as a trading partner. And here we are fast forward, and I want you to dig into that, but here we are fast forward where that level of competition is getting ever more intense. The last couple of years, the US has stepped up its limitations in which Chinese companies can get access to US technology, particularly semiconductors. NVIDIA's market share, which was 85% a couple of years ago, is now down to 50 and probably going down even further as their H20 and their other AI chip is China doesn't even want anymore. So when we look out over the next 5 to 10 years, is China the first major technological competitor that the US is facing? And what does that mean for just not only the global competition amongst themselves, but are US companies potentially going to lose the Asian market as customers? And when vying for other customers around the world, are we now we being the US, are going to have to compete head on with China when looking at Europe and the rest of Asia and so on.
I'm so glad you start with 2018 because I do think this is a breaking point. And yes, I think that China was completely blindsided when the US banned semiconductors. To be honest, they just weren't expecting it. It was a shot across the bow. And yeah, to your point, I think the leadership in China panicked a little bit. They did think if they're banning us from semiconductors today, tomorrow it could be chemical products, it could be auto parts, it could be anything. And so they decided to essentially, they told the banks, guys, normal loans to real estate, all the money has to go to industry, all the money has to go into developing our own tech system. They also got all the big tech guys in a room and said, guys, the US has declared economic war on us. I know you've been making lots of money, optimizing puppy videos on the internet, and this was great. Well done, you. But from now on, you guys have to develop semiconductors. You have to develop your own servers, your own software. And, this is when you had the whole Jack Ma incident. And suddenly Jack Ma goes on a stage in Shanghai and says, the government's trying to tell me how to run my business, but they have no clue. So the government says, I don't think you heard us correctly. Maybe we didn't make ourselves clear. Let's have this discussion again. And so there was a mobilization of all resources towards that goal for the past 7 years. And during these 7 years, I think the Western world looked at China and very much, saw the consequent real estate bust. If in the US, the government said no more loans to real estate wouldn't be so hot. So you have a massive real estate bust. And when you picked up your copy of the FT, the Wall Street Journal, whatever else, all you got was the real estate bust for 7 years. And I think we were kind of blind to how quickly China was moving up the value chain on the back of this wave of capital. And by the way, not just money, not just physical capital, also human capital. Because essentially the tech companies were told, stop hiring the best engineers out of Tsinghua and Fudan, the best universities in China, to build video games. From now on, you're going to develop semiconductors. Now, China produces more STEM graduates every year than the whole rest of the world combined if you exclude India. It's China in 25 years has gone from 350,000 university students a year to 12 million university students a year. So it's an improvement in human capital. And this human capital is essentially being driven for the past 7 years towards you have to develop our own tech solutions. We have to develop our own industrial solution. We have to completely de-Westernize our supply chains. And now all of a sudden we wake up to a world in which China's producing the best cars, not just the cheapest cars, but also the best cars. Here's a mind-blowing fact. Like you take Audi in China has now, which was the very first Western brand in China. It was synonymous of luxury for the longest time. They've dropped their four-circle branding and the Audi name to adopt a Chinese branding because if you're in China now, European cars are perceived as inferior to Chinese cars. Just to put things in perspective. Another example, I'm sure you've seen the interview of the Ford CEO where he highlights that he went to China, was blown away by what he saw, and bought a Xiaomi and brought it back to the US. And he drives a Xiaomi to work every day. I mean, this is like the Coca-Cola CEO saying he'd rather drink Pepsi. It's kind of mind-blowing to me. So I think, to be honest, China has leapfrogged the West in industry after industry. Take turbines, take telecom switches, take everything except the very high end of semiconductors. China's by now leapfrogged the West. And we missed it because for 3 years, nobody visited China because of COVID. And then once COVID reopened, post-COVID, Russia had invaded Ukraine. When you and I met, Peter, everybody was running around telling you China was uninvestable because they were going to invade Taiwan, because they were part of the axis of evil with Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So everybody missed that you had this huge step up in China's industrial capacity. And so now today, China's bidding in Saudi Arabia to build nuclear power plants at half the cost of the French. Being French, I look at this, I'm like, I always thought we'd own the nuclear space. I always thought that, we got lots of problems in France, but at least we got that. We don't even have that anymore. So it's, this for me, this one of the single most important macro development is how quickly China's moved up the value chain in terms of industry. And yes, it is knocking on the door of tech. And I'm sorry to be long-winded, but yesterday, the FT had an article saying, okay, Xi Jinping is now banning NVIDIA chips in China. I look at this and I think, okay, either that's hubris on the Chinese part. They think they're they're advanced enough that they actually don't need NVIDIA. Option one. And there was some inclination of that with DeepSeek, right? It's like, oh, we can produce DeepSeek without the high-end NVIDIA chips. Or they think that, Chinese chips, the Huawei, the SMIC, et cetera, are like close enough that all they need is a little more impetus and they'll get there. Or alternatively, Xi Jinping is trying to trip up the US market. Because if you trip up NVIDIA, NVIDIA in 2.5 years has gone from a 300 billion market cap to a 4.3 trillion market cap. 4 trillion of wealth creation in one company in less than 2.5 years. Unprecedented in the history of capitalism.
So now let's go to GPUs, and they are clearly our national champion. This is NVIDIA, right? So the debate here is whether we sell them our best technology, so that will make itself into their defense and intelligence apparatus, which is there to basically leapfrog us in so many different ways, right? So how do you think about this? Should we be selling them, even if it's a stripped down version, right, of our higher end GPUs? Because this is a battle that is really for supremacy on so many different levels for the next 50, 100 years, right? Is that fair to kind of categorize this that way? And that's really the debate. Should we be selling? Jensen Huang clearly has $4.3 trillion reasons why we should, but is it in our national interest to do so? And I get it. The idea is like, let's get them hooked on CUDA and, that sort of thing. But to your point about their ability to influence the rest of the world, there is going to be a digital belt and road, whether it's using Huawei chips or Xiaomi's backing or whatever the hell you want to kind of describe, or it's going to be on the backbone of our technology.
I think that's a good way to frame it. And to be honest, I'm not American. I'm not Chinese. I'm French. The question is, what relationship does the U.S. want to have with China? Is it a commercial relationship or is it an adversarial relationship? And it's not for me to answer. It's for you as voters. It's for U.S. policymakers to answer this. And I think the U.S. really hasn't decided what it wants to do. I think for up until 2018, essentially the U.S. was saying we definitely want a commercial relationship with China. We want to make as much money as possible, and so Apple puts its plants there, and Tesla puts its plants there, and Tesla provides the impetus for the EV industry to grow massively in China, etc. So up until 2018. The relationship was very clear. This is a commercial relationship. Everybody's trying to make as much money as possible. This is capitalism. Everybody's happy. Everybody works in the same direction. 2018, the relationship shifts. We're no longer commercial. We're now adversarial. And that was reinforced in 21 when Blinken and Sullivan met with their counterparts in Anchorage. Blinken came out of there saying the relationship will be commercial where it needs to be and adversarial where it needs to be, which, if you're China, you're like, well, where does that leave me? It's like, so, where is that line between adversarial and commercial? Can you be both at the same time? When the U.S. had an adversarial relationship with the Soviet Union, it was understood that it was two separate worlds. There was very, very little commercial transactions. Today, if the U.S. really wants to have an adversarial relationship with China, this has massive, massive implications for the U.S. stock markets. What's the value of Apple without China? What's the value of Tesla without China? What's the value of Walmart? What's the value of ExxonMobil that does a ton of business in China? All this in a way that just wasn't happening with the Soviet Union. So is an adversarial relationship with China in the U.S.'s long-term interest, to the extent that China is now essentially the biggest trade partner for almost every major market except for Mexico and Canada. If you turn around, if you're the U.S. now and you tell a Brazil or you tell a Chile, perhaps even a Germany or a Turkey, hey, look, it's us or them, they might pick them. This isn't the Cold War all over again. So can the U.S. even afford to have an adversarial relationship with China? And more importantly, what does the U.S. get out of it? Like, what's the end goal? To have an adversarial relationship with China. The U.S. did very well out of the commercial relationship with China. It's huge profits, again, at companies like Apple, like Tesla, etc. What does the U.S. get out of the adversarial relationship? Why would they want it? How does it work? And I don't think this has been properly laid out for either U.S. policymakers or U.S. voters. But again, it's not for me to decide. What I do note is that right now you essentially have your bum in between two chairs, where sometimes you want to be commercial, sometimes you want to be adversarial, and I think you get the worst of both worlds.
So this also gets into, as you said, the commercial and sort of call it the military angle. And the military angle is a lot because of Taiwan. I mean, I want you to explain to the listeners too, like China's history is not necessarily territorial. They're not looking to invade other countries. Taiwan obviously is unique because they genuinely feel like Taiwan's part of China. I would consider that a one-off. It's a big one-off. The U.S. has come to, the verbal defense of Taiwan. But if it wasn't for Taiwan, do you think we still would have reached, we being the U.S. and China, a level of commercial competitiveness that the world sort of would have still split apart? Like, is the U.S. is this their way of trying to stiff arm competition? Or is this a legitimate fear that we will at some point have a military conflict with China, a kinetic battle of some sort triggered by China's invasion of Taiwan, blah, 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 blah. I have my own thoughts on that, but I want to expand that with you.
So first, let me reassure all our listeners that China isn't going to invade Taiwan anytime soon. First, because I'm not sure they can pull it off. As we're seeing with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, invading countries is a tough business. Now, when you try to invade Ukraine, you're essentially sending tanks across wheat and cornfields. Here, you're talking about over 100 miles of sea, and it's quite a treacherous sea at that. So, chances are it's a much, much bigger operation. So that's your first hurdle. Then you simply look at the political calendar in Taiwan. So Taiwan, like every country, is split, a third left, Democratic Party that's very pro-independence, a third right, the Kuomintang Nationalist Party that's very pro-business with China. Like most right-wing party, they want to make money. And then a third that moves around. Now, today, the Democratic Party, pro-independence, is in power, but it is literally polling in the 20s. It has never polled this low. So if you're China, you know that you just wait 2.5 years till the next election, and the Democratic Party will be wiped out, potentially destroyed, like potentially just wiped off the face of the earth. The only way the Democratic Party survives is if China starts rattling the cage. And then people could swing back to it. So you're not hearing any noise from Taiwan, on Taiwan from China. You wait patiently till the Kuomintang comes back in power. Then you open the checkbook, you do a lot of deals, and you tie up Taiwan economically with China. So if you're worried about Taiwan from that front, it's the wrong worry. Now, to your point, I would invite your listeners to do a Google search on Taiwan. Just Google search Taiwan war in US media. And what you find is that for the longest time, nobody cares. When did people start caring? It starts really in 2021, because what happened in 2020? In 2020, I think two things happened, or in 2020 and 21, two things happened. First, TSMC leapfrogged Intel. All of a sudden, TSMC can produce 5 nanometer chips at scale in a way that Intel can't, and announces a 3 nanometer chip. So all of a sudden, and you can see it very clearly, up until 2021, TSMC has a market cap that's roughly a third below that of Intel. Today, it's more than 10 times that of Intel. So TSMC, and essentially starting in 21, it becomes clear that TSMC is now the leading semiconductor producer in the world. So, going back to what you started with, Peter, in 2018, the US government decides to essentially say, I'm going to pick a fight with China, and that fight, I'm going to fight it on the battlefield of semiconductors. Because I have the biggest comparative advantage in semiconductors. I can crack China there. And then lo and behold, 100 miles from China's shore, here comes the best semiconductor company out of nowhere. So now all of a sudden the US is like, oh darn, the best semiconductor company is no longer Intel. It's no longer within my walls. It's over there. Now all of a sudden Taiwan is geostrategically very important in a way that it wasn't before. So that's number one. I think number two, that what happened, to be honest, and here, this might sound a little more controversial, but again, look at the Google search terms, and you see it clearly. U.S. decides to leave Afghanistan, and the exit is a total shambles. Biden goes out to 60 Minutes to give an interview to sort of justify the shambles that it was. And out of nowhere in that interview, he says, and if China thinks that because we left Afghanistan, they can go out and invade Taiwan, we'll protect Taiwan, which was a huge departure from U.S. policy up to that point. The policy of the U.S. was strategic ambiguity. We're not going to defend Taiwan, but we're not going to say we don't defend Taiwan either. And this is something that he then repeats twice. And this drives China up the wall because it's a shift in the U.S. policy until then. This is also when Pelosi decides to go visit Taiwan, which is the highest ranking U.S. politician ever to visit Taiwan. So, like, this drives China absolutely up the wall because it shifts the sort of soft status quo consensus that had existed until then. And since then, things have toned back down. But following this period, and personally, I almost wonder, why did the U.S. put Taiwan in play? Was it the semiconductors? Or was it the fact that having just taken a huge black eye on Iraq and then a huge black eye on Afghanistan, you need to justify somehow the fact that you're spending $1 trillion a year on the military budget and never winning any wars? And perhaps the best way to justify $1 trillion budget is to say, oh, look, China's about to invade Taiwan. We do need to build the next aircraft carrier. We do need more F-35s, in case they do this. And so I think this combination of factor led to this. Now we're in a totally different environment. We're in a much healthier environment. And we're in a healthier environment because if you go back to 2018, when the US punches China, China takes the punch. You go back to 2021, China punches China again takes the punch. But during this time, it's preparing. 2025, Trump comes back in and punches China again. And this time, China says, okay, you want to do this? Fine. Gloves off. Let's go. You put embargo on semiconductors. I put embargo on rare earths. I put embargo on magnets. You want tariffs on me? I put tariffs on you. And China was the only one who fought back against Trump. EU, took the punch. Canada, Mexico, they took the punch. India, Brazil, everybody took the punch. China fights back. And amidst this fight back from China, the US realizes, hold on, without the magnets, in 2 weeks, the GM plant is shutting down. You've got Raytheon and Lockheed Martin saying, look, in a month, we can't provide weapons to Israel anymore. We can't provide them missiles because we're running out and we can't produce them without the rare earths. And so all of a sudden, the US realizes that, yes, China's vulnerable to us, but we're actually also vulnerable to China. So you get to this status quo, uneasy status quo. You look at the past 4 months, all of a sudden, nobody's talking Taiwan anymore. Again, do the Google search. It's fallen off the media landscape because we've now reached, I think, this truce between the US and China, where the US realizes if we push China too hard, this is actually going to start hurting us and hurting us big time. Because, if the US can't produce missiles, is it still the US?
Yeah, I think we overplayed our cards this time around, and I think that became clear. I actually agree with you on Taiwan. I think China is much more interested in a bear hug than militarily taking Taiwan. I think one interesting thing that I remember what you said in January 2024 when we were together and you were making your presentation, one of the byproducts of single child policy for many years, which obviously is not the case anymore, but a lot of parents have one kid. And the last thing that Xi Jinping wants to do is start having parents losing their one kid in a military conflict, when instead China believes that they can wait it out. They can hopefully, as you said, the KMT can take over and they can just do with Taiwan what they did with Hong Kong.
So on this, the deal that's supposedly on the table, I mean, it's rumors and take this with a very, very healthy big dose of salt. But the deal that's supposedly on the table for when the KMT comes back is that, but for this deal to happen, the KMT would need to have 2/3 of parliament because you can't change anything without 2/3 of parliament. So it may never happen. But essentially the deal would be for the next 50 years, the current status quo prevails. So 50 years, current status quo prevails. Then in 50 years, we have 50 years of one country, two system like Hong Kong. So you keep your currency, your parliament, you can keep your army, you can keep your police. You're just, you do you, but we present you internationally. So you travel around, you lose your passport, you go to a Chinese consulate. We represent you at the UN, etc. We can put military radars on in Taiwan, etc. So that brings you to 100 years. And then in 100 years, we have a full merger. And by then, who knows what China looks like? Who knows? Everybody who makes the deal is dead, long gone. And so the reason this deal would be a tremendous deal for everyone involved is first, it diffuses the tensions. Secondly, such a deal would mean that Taiwan wouldn't need to spend 3.5%, 4% of GDP in essentially buying weapons from the US, which is protection payment. So you free up that money immediately. But most importantly, you reduce the uncertainty for all the businesses. So you unleash a wave of investment and a re-rating of the market. You look at NVIDIA today, it's a 4.5 trillion, 4.3 trillion market cap. TSMC is a 1.3, 1.4 trillion market cap. Now, NVIDIA can't live without TSMC. TSMC can live without NVIDIA. TSMC, I think, is actually the most valuable technology company in the world because they're definitely a step ahead of everybody else. And what they do, nobody else can do. But half of the investors don't want to own it because of this fear that if China invades Taiwan tomorrow, TSMC ends up being a hole in the ground and just disappears. And your 1.5 trillion in market cap goes to zero overnight. Now, you remove that risk, that 1.5 trillion probably becomes 3 trillion, 4 trillion. Pick the number. I remember so well, back when we met back in January of last year, and everybody was telling me, can't invest in China because China's going to invade Taiwan, etc. I'm like, okay, great. Do you own NVIDIA? Do you own Broadcom? Do you own Tesla? Do you own Apple? And they're like, of course, stock goes up. It's best stocks ever, etc. I'm like, okay, great. So you're telling me China's about to invade Taiwan. What's the value of NVIDIA when China invades Taiwan? Like the value is zero. Like NVIDIA can't produce chips. When China invades Taiwan, NVIDIA's essentially done for. Now, to be very clear, I absolutely do not believe China's about to invade Taiwan. But there's a sort of internal contradiction in people's portfolios where on the one hand, they tell you China is uninvestable because of this Taiwan conflict. And on the other, they own a bunch of stocks that will get absolutely decimated if that ever did happen. Look, I think what's happened in the recent weeks, to me, it's so obvious. I've written it out, etc. The U.S.-China trade war is over. The U.S. has essentially said, okay, following the imposition of the rare earth thing, following the Geneva deal, they've backed down. Look at what's happened in the past few weeks. The past few weeks have been absolutely momentous. A month ago, you have the U.S. saying anybody who buys energy from Russia, we're going to punish. We're going to put in more tariffs. It's going to be terrible for them. So the U.S. sends out this message. 10 days later, you have Xi, Putin, and Modi who meet in Shanghai, and they're literally French kissing on stage, the three of them. They're like acting like they're the best buddies that have ever existed. Now, just that, by the way, is super important because let's discuss for a second what's the big macro trend, the big mega trend of the future that will change the world. When I'm in the US, all people want to talk about is AI. Sure, it's exciting, etc. When I'm in Europe, all people want to talk about is how welfare states are about to collapse because fiscal spending is out of control, etc. And so you got to buy gold and you got to buy Bitcoin, and we're coming to the end of the welfare states, and that's perhaps a big macro trend. Sitting in Asia, if you take a step back, you think, okay, today we have Russia, the biggest producer of cheapest commodities in the world. You have China, the biggest provider of capital goods, the biggest provider of capital now to other emerging markets because they have the cheapest cost of capital in the world, and the biggest producer of consumer goods. And then you have India, which is the biggest provider of cheap labor. And now those three leaders are saying, we're going to put these three things together, mix it in a pot, and see what comes out as a stew. Cheapest commodities, cheapest capital goods, cheapest cost of capital, cheapest consumer goods, cheapest cost of labor. It's going to be a boom of epic proportion that comes out of this, a boom of absolutely epic proportion. Now, you take your 30 biggest market caps in the world. 24 out of the 30 are American companies. 2 out of the 30 are Chinese companies, Tencent and Alibaba. One of them is Korean, Samsung. One of them is Saudi Aramco. One of them is Japanese, Toyota. But essentially, so here are your 30. Now, how many of these 30s are going to participate in this boom? If the big macro trend of the next 10 years is the economic integration of China, India, and Russia, the answer is Alibaba is definitely a way to play it. Tencent is perhaps a way to play it. But in your top 30 market caps, there aren't a ton. So I think that the reason these stocks are ripping is that picture in Shanghai. And then I'll go one step further, really showing you that the U.S.-China tensions are over. So the U.S., again, threatens everybody with sanctions if they deal with Russia. For the past 15 years, Putin has been lobbying China to build the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. And she chooses this very moment to announce to the world, you know what? The US just told me I shouldn't buy more energy from Russia. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to build a pipeline to buy 3 times as much. It's almost like he said, suck on that. Excuse my French. But it's like, talk about defying a direct US order. Now, you could say, again, it's hubris. You could say China's cruising for a bruising. Or it's just they feel pretty confident that things with the US are on an even keel, that the ability of the US to punish China is now limited. And so now all the gas that used to go to Europe is now going to go to China for a fraction of the price, priced in renminbi. And so now you know that for the next 30 years, China, a country that already produces twice as much electricity as the US, will now have the cheapest cost of energy in the world, which is a huge shift, and will pay for energy in its own currency. For the past 15 years, one of the big drivers of US growth was that the US had the cheapest cost of energy in the world, thanks to the shale revolution. This has just shifted. China is now the one that's going to have the cheapest cost of energy. So if you're a big believer in AI, if you think, forget this China, Russia, India economic integration, who cares, whatever, these guys are hicks. I don't care. If you think AI is where it's at, then the question becomes, do you think the constraint in AI is going to be access to computing power? Or do you think the constraint in AI is going to be access to cheap energy? Now, if you think constraint in AI is access to computing power, then you buy NVIDIA and you buy the US. If you think constraint in AI is going to be access to cheap energy, then what's happened in the past 3 weeks is that essentially China's already won that race. And I tend to believe that actually it is going to be constrained to cheap energy, and that getting access to cheap energy requires 10 years of investments, 15 years of investments. And China's now already ahead in that race because, again, they produce twice as much electricity as the US, and electricity in China is already much cheaper than the US. But they just took they essentially just got a call option to get even cheaper.
How does Trump save face here, right? Because, you mentioned that we have frameworks with all our allies. If you say the EU and Japan and, the UK, we still don't have much of a framework with our 2 largest trading partners, which is Canada and Mexico. But if this is going to be this sort of, freeze for the next couple of years, because it benefits the US and the Chinese feel like they have an upper hand, how does the Trump administration save face here if they're just kind of kicking the can down the road?
So you say you won on TikTok, which is, a detail of history, and in the whole scheme of things really doesn't matter all that much. But you do a deal on TikTok and the deal that's on the table is ByteDance doesn't give the algorithm that exists today. They create another algorithm. So it's like, here's essentially a shitty algorithm that you can put in this vehicle that will be owned by Oracle and by Andreessen, and that ByteDance keeps 20% of. And so you declare victory on TikTok, which is the thing that obviously is the interface that most Americans relate to. So it's the thing that Americans care about. You declare victory on TikTok and you move on. Just, it'll be like the victory in Iran. They came into Iran saying, we're going to do regime change, we're going to do this, etc. Drop a few bombs, declare victory, go home. And on the ground, nothing has changed. But it's, here we go. You declare victory and you move on, which is, by the way, much, much better than going through a 20-year war, whether economic or real war, etc. This is much better. You declare victory, you go on and you get on with your lives. The point I'm making is not that China's getting the upper hand in this US-China trade war, etc. The point I'm making is that it's over. It's and that's one of the many reasons Chinese stocks are ripping. The war is over. All you need now is the ticker tape parade down Fifth Avenue or Madison Avenue. You're going to get it, and it's going to be called the TikTok deal. That will be your ticker tape parade, and then you move on.
So Louis, to wrap up, even though we can talk for hours, to circle back on how we started this. As the 3 of us are investors, and we look out at the investing landscape over the next 5, 10, even more years, has the U.S. met its match with a lot of the certain sectors that we were once dominant in, and the game is changing. And when you think about that startup in Singapore, who's bootstrapping it, has a certain amount of money that they've raised, and they want to subscribe to an AI model. They need some servers and high-powered chips to power them, and they have U.S. products on one hand, and they now have Chinese options on the other. How competitive is the U.S. going to be with this China option?
I think first, it's actually different offerings. And this is where it's actually quite funny, is that the US, which is, an open society, very based on freedom, based on everything, the offers today out of the US, whether you look at your OpenAI or all the main offers are essentially closed-end systems. When China's systems are open-ended system, which is funny because it's like the opposite of what you would expect given the different societal backgrounds, but it reflects the resources of both. The U.S., their companies are so well funded, so rich, so much cash, they can't afford to be open, to be closed-ended, and China couldn't because it didn't have access to the high chips. It had to open its system like DeepSeek and let thousands of people offer solutions, etc. So the reality is, if you're a small company, you're probably going to go with whatever solution is cheaper, and China will most likely be offering the cheaper solutions. One of my go-to sayings is that when China enters a room, profits walk out. So China has entered the AI room. So if you think there's going to be tons of profits in AI, I think you're delusional. My 30 years of living in China have taught me that if you're competing with China, you've taken a wrong turn. Like, you need to take a deep look in the mirror and think about the choices you've made in your life. Because if you're competing with China, things are going to be very tough for you. So when it comes to AI, let's not kid ourselves. China is in the room. There will be no profits in that room. That's how it is.
Let's talk about some American brands that bet big on China, not just from a manufacturing standpoint, but also, this access to this rising middle class, which you might be able to make the argument that because of this kind of property bust, maybe it's less of a middle class that you have to sell to. Then if you think about demographics, and Peter kind of hinted, at this kind of one-child policy, and then this rising, unemployment rate for young people, maybe it's not the place for American brands. And then you think about this kind of nationalistic fervor, if you will. We've seen Tesla, we've seen Apple lose a lot of market share. I think both of them have kind of bumped out of the top 5 or so. How do you think of China, even if you have this detente from a trade standpoint, from just broader geopolitical, how do you see the environment for an Apple, for a Tesla, for other consumer products? Because the Tesla thing sounds like an all-out disaster. The likelihood that they ever recapture the market share that they had a few years ago, given what you just said and what's becoming very clear about the quality of EVs, that seems like a tough one. And then, do you think Tesla is going to be selling, Optimus robots in China too? So it seems like Tesla's kind of done in China. So just help us think about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, going back to what I said, if you think that the big macro trend is that integration of Russia, China, India, how many US brands really participate in this? And yes, look, the reason Tesla, the reason Apple are no longer doing well in China, I don't think it's as much nationalist fervor or anti-American sentiment. That might play a little bit into it. It's just their products aren't as good. Like, to be perfectly honest, like a BYD car is now superior to a Tesla car, and it's not even close. It's like by a long shot, and they're much cheaper. You take the BYD Seagull, which is essentially like a Honda Civic type car, sort of hatchback. You get that 500 kilometer radius, and you get full self drive with it, and that costs about $8,300 US all in. That's the BYD Seagull. Like, how does Tesla compete with that, right? A Tesla will be 4 times that price. And same with the iPhone. You look at the Huawei phones today, better cameras, better battery life, better everything. So, how do the Western companies compete? With a lot of difficulty. Because again, the big story of the past 7 years, which I'll talk about till I'm blue in the face, but we used to identify Chinese products as being cheap, and they were. It was cheap products being made cheaply. This is, I think, the mindset we have to shift ourselves. And I encourage everybody to go to China today to see what's on offer: the trains, the cars, the phones, the fintech solutions. We've been leapfrogged. And I think deep down, we have this sort of superiority complex in the West where we're like, well, of course our products are better. But just like Japanese cars became better than American cars back in the late 70s, early 80s, this is happening, but not just on cars, on literally everything. So how do we compete? The only way we can compete is by doing better stuff, is by doing better products. Now, what are we deciding in the Western world, whether in Europe, whether in the United States? Essentially, we're saying, we can't compete with this. Let's put up tariff barriers. Let's in fact just block their products. Let's embrace protectionism. But down this path, this is not a way to get your products better. You go down this path, which is the path that Brazil went down, the path that Argentina went down. The whole thing about protectionism is essentially you're encouraging your domestic producers to remain mediocre. And so we're saying, look, we're going to try to keep what we have here at home. And these guys will continue getting better and better, and we'll just stay mediocre. The only way we can compete is by competing and by getting better. Now, when was the Tesla today is the same Tesla as it was 5 years ago, essentially. The BYD today is so different from a BYD 5 years ago. It's not even funny.